Hey everybody, it's time for another chapter of the Twits by Roald Dahl and Quentin Blake. This one is called Chapter 9. Mrs. Twit Has the Shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you haven't shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground!" Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground, just like in the picture. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as it had been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and snuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair, quite the carpenter. "Just look at you there sitting in your same old chair," he cried. "And you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks!" cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger like a pistol. "You've got the shrinks! You've got them badly! You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen!" Mrs. Twit became so frightened, she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry in the slightest. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of old shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "Oh, I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "Oh, it's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going, I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Oh, tell me," she cried. "Tell me quickly." "Oh, we'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. I'm ready, I'll hurry, I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Chapter 10. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons, and he had fixed an iron ring into the ground. Can you remember how many balloons he has? 100. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring he had fixed into the ground. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on a string, trying to go up and up. And Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, and some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon, there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. "Oh, I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons, and the upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground? If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Let's check it out. Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Up, Chapter 11. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen, oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Now put me somewhere safe, and put more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel so safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a ghoulish grin. Can you do a ghoulish grin, Harry? That's very ghoulish. With a ghoulish grin, he knelt down at her feet, and he took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. And she went up like a rocket. "Ow!" she screamed, "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "Oh, what a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever." Doesn't sound like they were made for each other. Chapter 12. Mrs. Twit Goes Ballooning Down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of those balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the streets, and gnawing the held balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. And each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether, and she stayed still in the air. And she bit through one more string. And very slowly, she began to float. That's right, and it was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. And she now began to come absolutely. And as she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her knickers. What do knickers mean, Harry? They're undies. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. And that's a picture of her. And that is the end of Chapter 12. We'll see you next time with Chapters 13 through 16. See you later. Say goodbye, Harry.